So welcome to everybody in the room. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you to everybody online for joining us in this remote program. I am Charmaine Nelson, the Provost Professor of Art History and the founding director of the Slavery North Initiative at UMass Amherst. And we are all here in the room in Massachusetts. So thank you for coming to the first of 5 Fellows Talks this semester. First, I'll let you know who Slavery North, who we are, and what we do. So we're an initiative, which is the first step to becoming an institute or research center here at UMass. And we support research and research creation on slavery in Canada and slavery in the US North, which are really understudied and underexamined fields. The majority of research being created on transatlantic slavery studies, of course, is being done on tropical plantation settings. So we bring together fantastic scholars, artists, and students like David Montero, who's speaking today, and we give them support and funding and ask them to develop a cohort mentality where they actually talk to each other. Who figured? So what happens then is that, of course, scholars who work on these regions were usually not together because we're outnumbered by scholars who are focused on the tropics. So magic happens when we actually get to spend some time together, as you'll see today with David's wonderful talk. So first, I'll let you know, the format is that David's going to speak for about 45 minutes. And then we're going to have questions and conversation at the end. And that could be from questions in the room and also people online. Please either type your question or you can unmute and unmic. We'll call upon you to ask a question live as well. But first, I'll let you know, too, about the other 5 lectures, fellows lectures. Jennifer DeClue is going to be giving her fellows talk on March 25th at 3 o'clock. Julia Girati on April 15th, also at 3 o'clock. And then Alex Callender is going to follow up on Monday, April 28th, and then Kathy Goldenmeyer on May 5th. So we'll be, if you're in touch with us, please, you can go to our website, slaverynorth.com. You can sign up for our, subscribe to our initiative. We don't bombard you, okay? So we send out a quarterly newsletter, and we send out information about things like our talks and our events as well, okay? So we'll let you know when the next event is coming up, which will be, again, Professor Jennifer on Tuesday, March 25th at 3 p.m. Again, a hybrid event. So without further ado, I will introduce the esteemed scholar and investigative journalist, David Montero. So David is an artist in residence fellow with us at Slavery North. We're so privileged to have him with us for an entire academic year for 2024 and 2025. David Montero is an investigative journalist and an author. Formerly a documentary producer for PBS Frontline, his work has twice been nominated for an Emmy Award. Montero has written for Time, for the New York Times, and for The Nation, among others. And his most recent book is The Stolen Wealth of Slavery, A Case for Reparations, and it was published by Legacy Lit Hatchet Books in February 2024. David's project with us at Slavery North is entitled Merchants of Misery, the hidden history of how Boston bankers financed and expanded Southern slavery and how the profits of Southern slavery helped build Boston. So now I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be here and so proud to be part of the Slavery North initiative here at UMass Amherst. I want to thank Charmaine Nelson for creating this amazing one-of-a-kind place, which is so critical to studying our collective history. And I want to thank my wonderful colleagues, whom I have the privilege to learn from and collaborate with. And thank you to Emily Davidson for all that she does. And of course, thank you to all of you for being here. And if you are zooming in, thank you for being here. One of the many reasons I'm so excited about Slavery North is because I believe in its mission to change the way we look at the history of enslavement, to address the many myths and misunderstandings that still warp our sense of this history and its impact on the present. And that's what I'm hoping we might be able to do this afternoon through this talk, is dispel some monumental myths, particularly about Boston's role in slavery. The period we'll be discussing today is 1790 to 1865 and beyond. The reason being that in my mind, is the beginning of a corporate role or corporate involvement in the business of slavery. So this means everything we'll be discussing about Boston and enslavement took place after Massachusetts itself abolished slavery within its own borders anyway. O ye hypocrites, ye Boston hypocrites, why don't ye throw the cotton in the sea, as your fathers did the tea? Ye hypocrites, ye buy the blood-stained cotton in quantities so immense that you have run up the price of slaves to be more than $1,000. O ye hypocrites, ye denounce slavery, then ye bid it live and not die, in that ye buy sugar, rice, tobacco, and above all, cotton. Ye hypocrites, ye abuse the devil and then fall down and worship him. That's Frederick Augustus Ross, a Southern minister and enslaver himself, calling out Boston for its hypocrisy, its sanctimoniousness, its claiming to have no part of enslavement while profiting from it all the same. And in a sense, the hypocrisy that Ross called out all the way back then is still true today. Because as you know, there continues to be a prevalent narrative, and it's reinforced by big institutions and corporations and many people in this country, that enslavement just taking place in the South basically just enriched the South, the so-called planters, allowing them to live lives of opulence for a long time. And the same narrative says that when the North, which supposedly hated this barbaric system, turned on it and sought its destruction, all that Southern wealth from slavery disappeared, burned in the fires of the Civil War. The greatest fortunes this country and the world had ever seen suddenly gone with the wind. So many assumptions are molded into that rendering of history. Assumptions about North and South, about enslavement, about its profits. Assumptions molded to the point of myths. And if this were true, that all this wealth disappeared, it would mean that nothing had been gained in the end through slavery, almost as if the whole thing had never happened. And you can see why many institutions and corporations and people would cling to such a notion. Now, I came to this subject as an investigative journalist, and what I've been particularly interested in is understanding the astounding wealth that enslaved Black people created, and how that wealth shaped private, public, and institutional fortunes in America. Last year, I published a book called The Stolen Wealth of Slavery, A Case for Reparations. And I wrote this book to crystallize that slavery, among many other things, is not only a story of epic wealth, the wealth that 4 million enslaved Black people created in this country, but the story of wealth that has never died. And what I'm hoping to show you is that the story conventional history has been telling for so long about the wealth that slavery created is actually set in the wrong place and focused on the wrong people and constricted to the wrong time. One of the things that most startled me when I began this research some years ago is that it is not impossible to know how much wealth from slavery there was. There are reams and reams of statistical data. The problem is that we simply tend not to look. So let's start there. In my research, I learned that the US government, beginning in the 1780s, began cataloging every variety of crop grown across America's sprawling lands, tracking every pound of staple that we produced and we exported, and it did so year after year throughout the antebellum period. And that meticulous tracking of exports, of course, included cotton, the most precious, highly desired, most lucrative staple that enslaved people in the United States produced at volumes that were then unprecedented in the history of the world. And from those statistics the US Treasury compiled, we know the following: that between 1851 and 1860 alone, so just 10 years, Black people generated a bounty of cotton that was worth $1.5 billion then. That's something like $54 billion today. It certainly seems like a lot, but we can understand this figure by putting it into perspective relative to other wealth at that time. In my research, I also found official US Treasury figures that help us do that. In 1852, the US Congress undertook a massive investigation into corruption in the United States, as part of which it captured a unique snapshot of different facets of American wealth at that time. And so the Treasury Department, using Congress's findings, was able to make a report about all the stock ownership in the United States in 1852, all the stocks and bonds of 113 cities and towns, 347 counties, 985 banks, 75 insurance companies, 360 railroads, 16 canals, and 15 other corporations. So a lot of stocks. And Congress determined that the value of those assets amounted to $1.4 billion then. And so it means that the wealth enslaved people created through cotton in just 10 years, 1.5 billion, constituted more wealth than white people had accumulated in all the major stocks of the United States. I want to point out that the figure I'm citing, $1.5 billion, is wealth that enslaved people produced in just 10 years and only through cotton. This isn't even to consider that Black people, as we know, produced record-shattering amounts of rice and sugar and tobacco, hemp, turpentine, gin, bricks, iron, gold, etc. The list goes on and on. From the birth of the Republic to the end of slavery in 1865, Black people produced billions and billions of dollars of wealth for the United States. What would today be the equivalent to trillions? So my question for this afternoon, and the question that brought me here, and the question that first gave rise to my book is, where did all this wealth go? Did it just disappear overnight, or did it go somewhere else? And if so, where? I'm an investigative journalist, and as you know, the enduring creed of investigative journalism is follow the money. Money and how it's made, and more importantly, how it's spent, is the most illuminating story of all. More than people, I would argue, and more than places. I knew this because I'd written a book a couple of years ago called Kickback, in which I traced how Fortune 500 companies every year pay billions of dollars in corrupt bribes to government officials in foreign countries. They do this to win contracts and to pump up their profits. Essentially, my first book was about money laundering. And I knew from writing that book that if you look at money as a character itself, and you follow it, follow how it evolves, how it transforms, how it's laundered from one form to another, the path it takes and where it ends up is breathtaking and perspective shattering, and will make you question many of the assumptions you first held in the first place. So that's what I've been doing now in my research here at Slavery North, taking that lens of money laundering, of wealth as a central character, and applying it to the assumptions that warp the history of slavery. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon. Because when we follow the money, the trail of the extraordinary wealth that enslaved Black people in America produced, we can answer two critical related questions that can illuminate in a new way the central story of our nation's original sin. Who really reaped this wealth, and how? And if we do that, we can answer as yet another critical question. What did they do with this wealth? So follow along with me and you'll see that the story of enslavement and the wealth it produced is the story of the largest money laundering operation in the history of the United States. And that's the reason, as you'll also see, that the wealth of slavery never died. It lives all around us, in the institutional wealth, carefully protected, generationally transmitted, down the ages, through the most powerful vessel of immortal wealth protection this country ever invented, corporations, namely banks. To show you, I'm going to focus today on a particular aspect of my research, and that's how closely linked the northern banking system was to enslavement, because it illuminates how the roots of our modern financial system and its culture of greed and exploitation are to be found in the profits that these corporations stole from the unpaid labor of Black people. When I set out to find the wealth of slavery, I started looking in the South at particular families and at plantations, because I assumed, as conventional thinking tells us, that it was Southern families who sat at the top of the great pyramid of wealth making that enslavement generated. But I quickly found two things in my research. I found that the trail of wealth kept leading north. I found that the people who most consistently profited from Black people's enslavement were not in the South at all. And in a minute, I'll explain why that is. I also found something else, that all the eminent observers and writers and thinkers of that time, the time of enslavement, were saying the same thing, that the viciousness of slavery actually enriched the North, but left the South in a deeper state of poverty. Quote, there is no state in the Union, but it is poorer for slavery, remarked Theodore Parker, the abolitionist. Southern enslavers were actually enraged that the North profited so extensively from Black people's stolen labor, while the South was left with less and less. For that reason, an Alabama congressman fumed, the South thus stands in the attitude of feeding from her own bosom a vast population of merchants, ship owners, capitalists, and others who drink up the lifeblood of her trade. So hold on a second, that seems profoundly confusing. On the one hand, statistics showed very clearly that Black people's labor in the South was creating record-shattering world historical wealth. And yet on the other, that very system of enslavement was not making the South rich, to the point that its enslavers boiled with rage. How could that be? And the answer, as you'll see, is that the wealth of the nation was expanding because of enslavement. But the South wasn't where the story of that wealth was playing out. And that is because an essential dimension of enslavement, as monumental as the volume of wealth that enslaved people produced, was the equally astounding flow of this wealth out of the South. Each season, enslavers in the South, of course, had 1 to 2 billion pounds of products brought by enslaved people to move to markets, markets in the North, markets in England, markets in other parts of Europe. But how do you move 1 billion pounds of products each season from the interior of the South? That's like moving, by the way, 500,000 cars every summer. You need ships. And if the average ship can carry 500 tons, then you need 2,000 ships. But the South didn't have many ships. Enslavers didn't own them. So they had to pay someone else for cargo freighting on those ships. And enslavers didn't have the connections to markets in London and Liverpool to get their products to those faraway places. So they had to pay someone else for that too. And enslavers didn't own insurance companies to protect their goods from fire, loss, or theft on these long journeys across the globe. So they had to pay for that as well, and on and on and on. So what these figures show is that the system of enslavement in the South, contrary to popular belief, was often not a profitable enterprise, at least not for enslavers, because they were losing quite a lot of money. And the question is, losing it to whom? Southern enslavers, it turns out, were not at the top of the great pyramid of wealth making that enslavement generated for in this country. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't any Southern enslaving families who grew obscenely rich by exploiting Black people. The mansions that still stand in Charleston and Natchez and Mobile and other places are a testament that many did. I'm saying that it is far fewer than we have been led to believe. And that is why W.E.B. Du Bois, reflecting on this system, wrote, quote, for the slave owner and the landlord to keep a large or even reasonable share of these profits was increasingly difficult. And that is why another observer, William E. Dodd, wrote, thus, while the planters monopolized the cotton industry, drew to themselves the surplus of slaves, and apparently increased their wealth enormously, they were really but custodians of these returns, administrators of the wealth of northern men, who really ultimately received the profits of Southern plantations and Southern slavery. So now we come to the heart of our story. Who were these northern men? And how is it that their enterprises were at once so deeply entangled with the history of slavery, and yet so seemingly hidden to us now? They were men like this man, William Appleton, a son of the soil of Massachusetts. Appleton was born in 1786 in Brookfield. Moving to Boston in his 20s, he became a partner in a firm that specialized in the so-called West Indies trade, sourcing, financing, and selling products that enslaved Black people in the Caribbean were forced to make. Appleton became rich through that trade and eventually bought a large house, Beacon Street. With wealth he made from trafficking the wares enslaved people in the Caribbean made, he turned his sights to an even more lucrative business of exploitation. He purchased a number of commercial ships, which you see listed here. And note how, as time goes on, carrying capacity of Appleton's ships got bigger and bigger. That's because Appleton's business was transporting larger and larger quantities of cotton from southern plantations to the textile mills of Boston. Appleton got richer and richer this way. And over time, he became a close friend to many of the largest enslaving families in the South. These were the people, by the way, who made a lot of money, including two of the largest enslavers in the history of the United States, Stephen Duncan of Mississippi and William Aiken of South Carolina. From 1815 until he died in 1862, I've tracked from his diary and his letters, Appleton, in fact, spent many months a year living in the South, often at the plantations of his friends. Here he is in his diary describing a visit to the plantation of William Aiken in South Carolina, where he notes the quote, supposed great care that is taking care of the 800 Black people that Aiken enslaved, many of whom were children. Conventional history always portrays men like Appleton as merely a merchant or a buyer in the so-called dry goods trade. But these are deceitful labels that distort history. I spent the last 5 years researching the business records of men like Appleton and the system of cotton financing in which he operated. And I've come to understand that figures like Appleton weren't merely transporting cotton on their ships. Their records show that they were lending money to enslavers throughout the South, buying their cotton in an elaborate system of credit. The entire institution of slavery worked on a system of loans. A buyer like Appleton would advance hundreds or thousands of dollars to an enslaver. The enslaver would use this loan to manage his plantation, including often to purchase more enslaved people. And then when the cotton harvest was reaped that season, the enslaver would repay Appleton with thousands of pounds of cotton, which Appleton would then transport on his ships and sell. Appleton, in other words, was directly investing into slavery, and his money financing the subjugation of Black people in the South. Today, all of William Appleton's surviving business records are housed at the Harvard Business School Library. I've been going through these records for many months now, detailing loans that Appleton was making throughout the South. And that's what you see here. Bills denoting his purchases of cotton and his loans in places like New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama. As you can see, over the vast and destructive life of enslavement, affecting more and more Black people's lives, Appleton's cotton account grew and grew and grew. He knew intimately well what life on plantations was like. He had visited those plantations. He didn't care. It was good business. From the early 1800s, Bostonians like Appleton had been showing up at plantations not only with ships to transport cotton, but with easy credit. And they lent more and more money. And Southern enslaving families took and took and took. Why? Why would Southern enslavers take loans? Well, as you saw earlier, slavery was prohibitively expensive to operate. And so Southern enslaving families increasingly turned to Northern men like Appleton as a bank. In fact, that's not just a figure of speech. Why are we so concerned with William Appleton? He's just one man. The answer is because of whom Appleton was connected to. In 1830, William Appleton banded together with 11 other men in Boston, many of whom, like him, had built their business empire around Black people's exploitation, trading and transporting the commodities these enslaved people needed. And what William Appleton and these men together did was create a new bank called Columbian Bank, one of the most important and longest running banks in Boston's history. Before I say more about these men, I want to explain first how a bank at that time actually functioned and what a bank director then actually did, because it'll illuminate a lot. And to explain this, I'm going to quote from an official history of Citibank, written by two former Citibank employees and published by Harvard University Press in 1985. These authors describe that banks in Appleton's time were created to be, quote, a kind of credit union for its merchant owner. The directors like Appleton weren't paid a salary. Quote, compensation came in the form of liquidity and access to credit and services, end quote. This meant a director like Appleton, heavily invested in cotton sales and transportation, would, quote, borrow from the bank to finance his purchase of goods and then, quote, repay the bank from the proceeds of the sale of the goods. What this means is that Columbian Bank, through directors like Appleton, was financing slavery, and slavery was building the profits and deposits of the bank. And as his bank got richer, Appleton used those funds to expand his empire. Flush with money from cotton, he invested in more ships, carried more cotton. Then he founded the Suffolk Manufacturing Company and the Tremont Mills, some of the most significant textile mills in New England. He also became an investor in railroads and insurance companies. He began sending cotton from the South, transported on his own ships to his own mills, secured by railroads and insurance companies he led, all while using credit and services from the bank he ran. A business empire vertically integrated around Black people's stolen money. I want to point out that many of the other directors of Columbian Bank did the same. By owning ships and financing cotton, sugar, and rice, oh ye hypocrites, right? Enriching themselves through Southern slavery, they became industrialists and tycoons in the North. And they did this even though they never enslaved any Black people themselves. And that was the whole point of the system. They did not need to be directly involved in managing the violence inflicted on Black people in the South to profit from that violence. They enriched themselves in this way even long after Massachusetts itself had abolished slavery. Appleton was not the only Boston banker who did this, and Columbian Bank was not the only bank that profited in this way. I've been tracing the records of George Pratt, a powerful director at New England Bank. And as he ran that bank, Pratt was one of the top financiers of cotton in Boston, annually funneling tremendous sums of money to enslavers and selling their harvests across the world. Henry Oxnard was not only a prominent director of State Bank in Boston. Together with William Appleton, he owned a number of ships and transported millions of pounds of cotton from the South to the textile mills. By the 1820s, when cotton plantations and slavery were growing, so many of the patriarchs of the great Boston families, the Lawrences, the Lowells, the Amerys, the Perkins, the Goddards, made their money in this way. It was precisely because of their connections to enslavers, because of their success in a world predicated on coercion and violence against Black people, that these men were elected to be directors of these banks in the first place. All around them throughout Boston, all the most affluent capitalists were the same men who shipped cotton on their ships, their textile mills, who brokered cotton sales, who financed slavery from afar. It was they who took the greatest cut of the pie. Obviously, enslavement in the South could never have functioned without the services of these northern men. By the late 1820s and early 1830s, these men built dozens of banks like Columbian Bank in Boston, and dozens more banks like this in New York, in Philadelphia, in New Jersey, and in Baltimore. Over the course of the last 5 years, I've found that just as there were thousands of enslaving families throughout the South, there were thousands of corporate directors like William Appleton in the North, clustered all throughout Wall Street and Boston, advancing money throughout the South, expanding the misery of slavery. This is not just the history of slavery, it's the origin and the evolution of the financial construct in which we still live today. And it was all based on loans, on a toxic pool of debt churning at the heart of slavery. So let's look more closely. What do we think happened by the 1830s when the business of Boston banks was to traffic in easy credit to white men seeking to profit from the abuse of Black people? Fortunes rose in textiles and cotton and slavery, driven by bankers at these banks. Boston began purchasing nearly 1/6 all the cotton enslaved people produced, a central pillar of the enslavement system. And the bankers became greedy for even more. They knew that there was even more money to be made if slavery spread even wider. And that's what they wanted, more misery, millions more Black people's lives devastated. And the bankers of Boston and New York also knew that for slavery to spread, this evil required vast stretches of more land. And the great prize in the 1830s, of course, was Mississippi and Georgia. So what did they do? They organized their capital to ensure that Boston had a slice of this expanding slavery pie. At the Merchants Bank here in Boston, Director Mark Huey and President Franklin Haven, along with other directors from other banks, began buying up hundreds of thousands of acres of land in Mississippi. They incorporated a company called the Boston and Mississippi Land Company, run out of Merchants Bank, to do so. Hundreds of Bostonians bought shares in this company and bought countless acres of land in Mississippi. Records at Duke and Harvard that I recently found show that Boston's banks played a singular role in procuring, financing, profiting from the sale of indigenous people's land in Mississippi, the prelude to the expansion of slavery. And I'm still untangling how those banks worked hand in glove with the US government to expel Native peoples from these territories. Here's the New York Herald, by the way, lambasting Mark Huey at Merchants Bank for his scheme to cheat indigenous people out of their land, paving the way for the violence of the Trail of Tears. So what happened after Mark Huey and Boston bankers bought up nearly 2 million acres of indigenous land in Mississippi and Georgia in the 1830s? Let's take a closer look. While researching my book, I came across a harrowing but now largely forgotten episode in our history. And I want to talk about it now because I think it crystallizes how entangled enslavement was with Boston and Boston with enslavement. In old newspaper accounts, I began reading of the earliest expansion of slavery in Mississippi in the 1830s. Stories that appeared first in one newspaper and then repeated in many. One newspaper wrote that the number of enslaved people at first arriving in a small stream into Mississippi had by 1834 tripled. Other newspapers reported that between 1833 and 1836, in that 3-year period alone, enslavers sold and transported 250,000 Black people to the new frontier of slavery, the plantation lands opening in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas. 250,000 Black people in just 3 years. This was one of the single largest, most cruel expansions of slavery in American history. Here's what the other newspapers reported. White men sold each of these Black people on average for $600. Horrible. It means that the entirety of this vile transaction, 250,000 Black people sold at $600 apiece in 3 years, cost $150 million then, something like $5 billion today. We must remember, as newspapers carefully detailed and discussed at the time, the white people buying these enslaved Black people, the white people settling the lands in Mississippi and Alabama to make plantations had no money. Mississippi was a blank slate. It had yet to be created. There were no banks or hardly any to speak of. So where did $150 million come from? And the answer is it was borrowed from Wall Street, from Boston banks, in 1,000 big and small transactions lent by great banks and unknown merchants all up and down the eastern seaboard. In many of these loans, white enslavers put up as surety, as collateral, to northern bankers, the Black people they enslaved. By 1837, because so much of this lending was going on, speculation in cotton became so rife, and actually the price of cotton doubled, and the borrowing and the lending became more rampant, that a devastating bubble formed, led by banking greed. And when the price of cotton unexpectedly collapsed, what happened? The bottom of the US economy fell out, one of the worst financial crises in US history. And as many as 5,000 plantations in Mississippi alone defaulted on those loans. For the next several years, newspapers across the country reported on the continuing fallout. It was estimated that Southern enslavers owed merchants and bankers in New York $100 million. The debt owed to Boston banks was estimated at more than $10 million. In the aftermath of these defaults in the ensuing economic crisis, abolitionist newspapers, including many here in Boston, started reporting on a previously unknown and harrowing spectacle. Across the South, sheriffs were selling Black people, including many children, on the auction block to satisfy these debts owed to bank directors in the North. It meant that due to the defaults, some of the most prominent investment bankers on Wall Street came to own tens of thousands of acres of plantation land and hundreds of enslaved people, as poignant a sign as any of how deeply involved the banks of the North were in running slavery. How many Black people, how many children were sold to satisfy the debts owed to Boston and New York bankers? We simply don't know. Our history doesn't tell us, but it's something I continue to investigate. This right here was deeply eye-opening to the abolitionist movement. From this period, I think you really see a shift in the rhetoric and tactics of abolitionists. Why? They began to see and explore and call out how deeply the North was to blame for the evils of Southern slavery. They began to understand that destroying slavery would require destroying support for it in their own backyard. That the lifeblood of slavery was the capital and the capitalists of Wall Street and Boston. This is worthy of underscoring. They knew this at that time, the role of the North. Yet that is a sensibility in a dimension of this history that is somehow lost to us now. It's a wholly modern construction to believe that slavery was only controlled by the South and only enriched the South. This process of profit-making and bank-lending, excruciating to Black people's lives, went on for 30 more years until the Civil War. One historian at the time, using US Treasury statistics, calculated that the Southern states by the 1850s exported to the North roughly $462 million a year in goods produced by enslaved people, and that Northern businessmen reaped basically half. There was so much at stake for Northern banks, Northern capitalists, in the continuation of Southern slavery. Is it any wonder then that Boston elected as its representative in Congress none other than William Appleton? Appleton, whose business empire was based on global slavery, who continued to profit from the global sale of cotton, who personally financed the scheme known as colonization to deport all free Black people from the US, who was president of the Boston Sugar Refinery, the largest such enterprise of its kind in America, which was wholly reliant on Cuban slavery for its sugar, and who continued to profit from Southern plantations. This man, Appleton, unsurprisingly, did all he could while in Congress to protect slavery, to undermine the abolition movement. Fortunes, so many fortunes were reaped by men here in Boston through the wealth that Black people had made, such that by the time the Civil War was fought, and even after slavery was destroyed, the wealth it created was not. Northern white men and those Southern enslavers who had the means had been investing it for decades. Like Appleton, they had invested it into corporations, thousands of corporations. They had laundered it into industry, into banks, into politics, into real estate, into art collections, shaping the cities we live in, creating our universities, our museums. I'm going to end my talk today with this thought. It's often argued that because all the people involved in slavery are long dead, there is no one and nothing to hold to account. And that might be true about the people, but what I'm trying to show is that long after men like Appleton are gone, the institutions and banks and corporations they created live on. And they live on because of wealth made and invested from enslavement. Yes, some corporations disappeared or went bankrupt, but many haven't. They've evolved into other things. What happens to all the banks in Boston that have been profiting from enslavement in the South? In the 1960s, many of them were bought up by Boston National, which then was swallowed up in the 1990s by Fleet. And now today, all of these banks, enriched through enslavement and cotton and tobacco and sugar, yes, that's not the only way they made money, but that was a significant part of how they made it. All those banks are now, through a process of commercial evolution, through consolidation and acquisition, the Bank of America. For a corporation to evolve out of slavery profits to other legitimate, quote unquote, pursuits is a very American story, right? It's the American story. As we know, we're living through an unprecedented period of institutional soul-bearing around slavery. Dozens of universities, religious organizations, not to mention cities across America, including Boston, have begun exploring their complicity in slavery and outlining programs for repair. And yet, so far, hardly a single corporation in America has ever even acknowledged its deep ties to enslavement, even publicly acknowledged it, let alone outlined a proposal for reparations or repair of some kind. Part of the reason why is what we've been talking about today. Our history is hijacked by myths and hidden behind lies and privilege. So conventional history continues to talk about slavery as something that happened in the South. The North was not to blame. We are not to blame. The money disappeared. There's no link, and so on and so forth. See for yourself how many banks and corporations today celebrate their deep roots in history, while lying to you that their founders were merely merchants. But merchants of what? Of misery. It's part of their enduring privilege not to tell this story, to hide and whitewash it. I hope part of the way we break the cycle of distortions, break this hijacked history, repeating falsehoods in a loop, is by all of us, the public, knowing where their money really came from. I'll end there. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much to David Montero. As a Canadian, and there's some Canadians in the room, it's like, yeah, ditto to us, right? So, David, the next book,
Yes,
you know, work on Canada.
Right.
Questions in the room? Yeah, we start here. Yes, we can.
It's kind of a common question. About 3 years ago, when my wife Kathy and I were in London, we saw an exhibit that was put in the Bank of England that dealt with the merchants who profited by slavery in the United States. Perhaps you could ask. Are you familiar with
Yeah, and I think Kathy shared. Oh, yeah. I was familiar with the exhibit. I had not seen it, but then it was great to see the photo. Yeah. I don't know if you were done with it.
Yeah, I just wanted to make that note.
That exhibit and that initiative by the Bank of England has always been really interesting to me because there is not, as I mentioned, a single bank in America that has done something like that. In England, Lloyd's of London and first came forward in 2020 and admitted its involvement in slavery. And it set off a very interesting chain reaction of other corporations and banks in the UK that started delving into this history. And I think it's limited, but that has changed the discourse around how England became as wealthy as it is today. And you would like to see something like that happen here, but there's just a total wall of silence, and you can imagine in this administration.
I'm just curious, just to follow up, if you've actually spoken with someone or anybody at the Bank of America about their history and how they sort of.
Not yet. When I wrote my book, I reached out to Citibank, Bank of America, Bank of New York, a lot of them. None of them responded to me, but I did have very interesting dealings with Citibank. And I talk about that in the book, and I'll just briefly mention that I spoke to Citibank over the course of many months. And I focused on Citibank in the book. I detail this more. Citibank, more than most banks in America, had such a foundational role in the expansion and financing of slavery. So I really wanted to focus on them. They really didn't want to talk to me, but then they eventually came back to me and said, well, you know, we've looked into our history of enslavement and we didn't find anything. So, shocker, you know, what is it that you want to know? And I said, well, with all due respect, I think you're wrong. I think you should look again. Here are the names of the directors of the bank who founded Citibank. You should look them up. You should see, because 9 of the 14 of founding directors of Citibank were enslavers themselves. They were deeply involved in stuff. Anyway, this person said, okay, thanks. She came back a few months later and she said, oh, gee, you know, we've been looking around and wow, the internet is really amazing. There's so much more out there today that we didn't know about before. And we are going to make a statement in a couple of months about this. And I thought kind of naively, wow, they're finally going to embrace this history. In July of 2023, Citibank did released a statement for the first time in its history, and it made big news. It was in the New York Times, it was covered by the Post, and basically what they said was we might have benefited from enslavement, but we could find no records that Citibank owned enslaved people itself. Now, right. Why this is so ridiculous is because that is not, and that's why I pointed this out in my presentation. That's not how a bank at the time worked.
Right.
To understand what the bank was doing, you have to understand what its merchant owners were. They were all involved. So it's very, very, it's actually a very clever legal jargon that they're using because you won't find any records showing that Citibank enslaved black people itself. That's not how the system worked. Anyway, that was the extent of my involvement with them. They basically said, yeah, we're going to release this statement and we've finally done this review, and then the review came out and it was like, oh.
Okay, sorry, there's still so many more hands coming up. So Jennifer, and then Jessica, and then Chris online, okay?
Thank you so much. This is so illuminating and really helpful for everything that we're thinking about at Slavery North. And my question was around how was it that the northern merchants had connections that the southern planters did not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, part of it was by virtue of their being so landlocked, so far away. You know, the obviously the best connections were to Liverpool in particular, because that was the biggest buyer of American cotton in the world, right? But also tobacco and white sugar. And southern enslavers were too far, but also they did not invest in those relationships. Something that southern enslavers used to lament themselves and that northern merchants used to lament is that the South, as I pointed out, they didn't invest this wealth into anything except slavery. They did not invest into ships. They didn't invest into infrastructure. So they came to rely on northern men like Appleton to do all that marketing and selling. Some southern enslavers in an early period, like 1812, 1815, they had direct connections to London houses. But because of disruptions in the War of 1812, that system kind of fell apart. And all these middlemen emerged to take up, basically to nip at the margins of cotton selling. And most of those people were in the North because they had long-standing business relationships with England. So yeah, it was I guess part of it was the South just did not invest the time to have those kinds of.
Yeah, I'm Jessica Reyes, capitalist economist from Amherst College. And first a comment and then a question. The comment is, I don't know if you have worked at all with Nico's who's doing the racial history of Amherst College. So Israel Trask is one of our founding donors, and he was a large enslaver. But Appleton and Pratt are names that are all over Amherst College.
Okay.
So you might want to, she's up to almost 10,000 descendants of people who were enslaved by Israel Trask.
Wow.
And anyway, you might want to get in touch with the folks in the racial history college. And but my question is, I'm thinking about when I co-taught a racial capitalism class with a historian semester, and one of the conversations which students were most engaged was this productivity debate, right? Was it the seeds that got much better and the technology of growing cotton, or was it the calibrated violence of what happened in the 1800s in terms of greatly increasing cotton productivity? And I'm wondering that I have this thought as you're doing this, that is sort of, that's the wrong discussion, right? You're saying, okay, that is actually not even about, that's just about scraps, right? Because most of the profits were not there. The enslavers didn't. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts about how this relates to that big, debate between the economists and the historians.
Well, I mean, a partial answer would be part of the increase in productivity and output was this wealth, the loans that were being poured from Wall Street into southern slavery, also buying up the land. That's also what helped, not helped, but allowed this entire system to expand was the money. Yeah. I mean, that fertilized this heinous system equally as destructively as the output.
Okay, Chris online. Chris, are you gonna unmute the mic?
Sure. David, thank you so much for your presentation. Nice to see your research. I have two, I guess, sort of questions and maybe future research directions. One of them is, so obviously some of these like northern wealthy merchants weren't sort of directly implicated in slavery, but do any of them come from sort of families of New England that were really tied to like historical shipping? I know Rhode Island was a big slave port sort of earlier in the 18th century. And then my second question is something sort of about these northern states and sort of their elimination of Black presence in population. So have you seen anything about banks being tied to like housing or land purchases and trying to sort of discriminate against Black settlers and Blacks even sort of staying? I know Connecticut, I think, passed a bunch of municipal bylaws sort of trying to push them out. And I assume that banks play a role in that, absolutely.
Yeah, well, good questions. The first question, yeah, I didn't have time to go into it, but so many of these men that I'm studying, how did they get their start? It's because their father owned a series of commercial ships that had been going to the South. William Appleton was not one of those people. His father was a preacher, but another man I mentioned, George Pratt, that's how he started. He grew up in the quote unquote Southern trade. So from the 1700s, his father from Malden here in New England had been doing brisk trade with the South. And so George Pratt just inherited that. And so many of these families, that's the case. They own ships, and the ships sailed to the South. And this was in a time before cotton. They weren't, in the 1780s, they weren't shipping cotton because it wasn't being produced. But they were shipping other things that enslaved people made, tobacco, rice, sugar. And they were loaning money in the same system that I was describing. So yeah, it's a lineage. And so again, so many of the families in Boston, that's how they became wealthy and that's how they started out. About your second question, that is a really interesting question. I don't know specifically how banks worked to sort of redline areas in New England, but what I started to point out and what I detail a lot more in my book is that bank directors in Boston and New York were intimately involved in the project of colonization, which I mentioned. This scheme to deport all free Black people from the United States. And the reason they wanted to do that was they did not want there to be the possibility for a person to be Black and free in the United States. If you were Black in the United States, you were meant to be enslaved or you were meant to be deported. Appleton, many bank directors managed and financed and even loaned their expertise in shipping because the colonization project did result in thousands of Black people going to Liberia. Some of them chose to do that, but that was different than what men like Appleton were making them do. In other words, Appleton wanted them forced out. But so that's not exactly what you were talking about, but it speaks to this ethos that these bank directors were very much involved in projects to destroy the possibility of Black freedom, Black citizenship, and they worked to put that scheme into reality.
And David, maybe we can just throw out the last question. Your wonderful talk is making me rethink what I think I know about the American Civil War and who was on what side.
Yeah.
Because these bankers, of course, okay, I can see that probably, correct me if I'm wrong, they would not have wanted the South to split, but not for any kind of abolitionist reasons.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, we need you to stay put because we need to continue to steal your profits, no?
Exactly.
And so where were they politically, those who are still alive at that moment on the verge of the Civil War? And what were they doing politically, agitating with all their money?
Exactly. This is such an important part of this history. I would argue these men did so much to push the country towards civil war. They invested their money into destroying the abolitionist movement. There are great passages from Frederick Douglass talking about how the mobs that would beat up abolitionists in New York were funded by Wall Street bankers. And so they took their capital and they organized it to destroy abolition, but also to start rallies, tens of thousands of white men coming out into the streets of New York City in the lead up to the Civil War, so the 1850s, 1855, 1857, saying that we are going to fight in the coming race war that is coming, we will stand for the white race. And abolitionists, if you want to side with black people, well, you're going to die with them. Tens of thousands of white men organized to come out in these kinds of rallies multiple times. And this was called the Union. It was, ostensibly to save the Union. But what did they do? They actually turned up the heat so much in the acrimony between North and South and between abolitionists and non-abolitionists. So it is very confusing. The many of the people who most vociferously defended slavery were these men on Wall Street in Boston, defending states' rights to continue the system of slavery. But yeah, they I think had a big role in pushing the country towards slavery.
Thank you so much. Again, a round of applause for
David. Thank you.
You can try to keep talking to David if you like and enjoy some food. And thanks to everybody online for joining us. And our next talk will be Professor Jennifer DeClue on Tuesday, March 25th at 3 o'clock. Hope you join us then as well. Thank you. Take care.